What's up, addicts? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. In this video, we are taking a look and breaking down Darren Waller, tight end for the Las Vegas Raiders heading into the 2020 season. Hit that subscribe button for more content like this, and let's get right into it. Last year was a phenomenal year for a tight end that in most redraft leagues wasn't even being drafted. A guy you got in double-digit rounds in high-stakes leagues and was a league winner for a lot of people. Finished with 90 receptions, 1,145 receiving yards, only 3 total touchdowns. That was his lone sore spot last year, but finished with over 220 fantasy points, averaging 13.8 fantasy points per game, which was 6th best amongst tight ends. And at least from a week over week perspective, was pretty consistent. Had 6 weeks where he didn't eclipse 10 points, but you'll still take that from a tight end. Gave you 2 weeks where he finished as a top 3 tight end, a couple more where he finished as a top 6. Did have 6 weeks where he didn't even finish in the top 12, but again, his worst game was 7 points, so you'll take it. Never really completely tanked your team if you were expecting more of those weeks. It just didn't work out for you. And honestly, the only real thing to note about Darren Waller was as the season went on, he typically performed better when the other targets around him were hurt. Once Foster Moreau and Hunter Renfrow were both running around, he saw his target share go down, and it kind of varied throughout the season. But for the most part, Darren Waller was pretty heavily involved. And I mean, this was a offense that was pretty devoid of pass catching weapons for the majority of the year, and Darren Waller really stepped up and took over that role. Now, that being said, what did he do with those targets? Again, high target share for a tight end. He finished with the 4th greatest target share for his team, 23.8%. And he did a lot with the passes that he got as well. Finished with the 2nd most yards after the catch with 565. Averaged 12.7 yards per reception, which is 6th best amongst tight ends, and 9.8 yards per target. He also had a very high contested catch rate of 57.9%. That was the best amongst tight ends. I did have 7 drops, but considering the high amount of targets, that's to be expected. All right, so those are all the positives about Darren Waller, and you cannot sit here and not recognize the season that he had. The concerns are as follows. For one, this is the first year that he done it. Nobody even really knew who Darren Waller was heading up to this point. He had some lingering off the field issues that had kept him from really reaching his stardom, and there were a lot of people that were excited about him for many years, and this was finally the season for him to break out. So from a talent perspective, he could most certainly keep it up. My concerns are more so in the changing environment of the team for the Raiders. So there's a total of 68 vacated targets, but over the course of the offseason, they've added Henry Ruggs, they've added Bryan Edwards, they've added Lynn Bowden, and one thing that no one seems to be talking about is they added Jason Witten. Foster Moreau is still there as well, as is Hunter Renfrow and Tyrell Williams, and everyone's expecting Josh Jacobs to take a step forward in the passing game. So my concern is how many passes do we expect there to be in Las Vegas with Derek Carr under center? Yeah, I think everyone's kind of expecting him to take somewhat of a step forward going into 2020 when you look at all the weapons that they added around him. It's kind of to be expected for this passing game to increase in volume a little bit, but how much can we reasonably expect? Darren Waller was a product of being the main target in the offense last year, but with this massive influx of new weapons, and again, I mean, I don't want to sit here and say that, oh yeah, Jason Witten is going to take all the targets, but why did they go out of their way to sign Jason Witten, a guy who got about 80 targets last year, to come over here and do absolutely nothing? So my concern for Darren Waller is his volume is going to decrease pretty drastically. And while I think he'll still be efficient with the volume that he does get, if he's not finishing with a 23.8% target share and he's not scoring a massive amount of touchdowns, he's really limiting your upside, because with tight ends, you pretty much need one or the other. So you get guys like Travis Kelce and George Kittle that perform regardless of how many touchdowns they get because they have massive volume and they're one of the leading targets on their team, or you get tight ends that just score a lot of touchdowns and they become valuable with that. Well, if Darren Waller is doing neither, then he is going to be overdrafted and is going to end up being someone that you're disappointed with at the end of the year. Right now, we have him projected to be getting a decent amount of targets still. We still have him finishing with 68 receptions, which is a good drop from where it was the previous year, but that's not terrible. Finishing with 813 receiving yards and 5 total touchdowns. It puts him right at about 180 fantasy points. So it still puts him in that middling tier of tight ends, but that would still be a drop of about 40 to 50 fantasy points based on the range of outcomes here. And honestly, I don't really see him performing much better than this unless some of the rookies just don't take and he ends up being a much bigger part of this offense than is originally planned, or if there's some injuries around him, kind of like last year, and he just by nature of how everything is going around him, he has to command more targets. Then you could see his volume going back up, and we know what his ceiling is because he showed it to us last year. I just don't really see a world where he comes anywhere close to hitting the same point total that he did the year before. And last year you basically got him for free. That was what created his value. Whereas now there's like 8 tight ends going around the same spot that are probably going to finish pretty close to each other. And if you're having to spend a 5th, 6th round pick on a guy like Darren Waller, you're banking on him being able to hit closer to his ceiling, and I just don't really see a world where that happens when you consider everything else that's happening on the Raiders. So Darren Waller is an avoid for me this year. I don't think he's necessarily going to bust. I think he'll be fine. And if you can get him at a value pick, like if you're in an auction draft and you get him for cheap, or he just falls to like the 7th or 8th round, I'll still take him. I think he'll still be productive enough to warrant wanting to use him, but I think he's being overdrafted right now based on where he finished last year. There's too many things that have changed for the Raiders for me to feel nearly as comfortable with the workload that he's expected to receive in 2020. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hit me up in the comment section below if you have any questions, and we'll see you guys in the next video where we break down the Rams.